relationship to the world in economic terms and more broadly. And obviously, McKinsey is trying to contribute to that public discussion, as are we at the Peterson Institute. So I'm also delighted to ask Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow here at the Peterson Institute, to discuss directly Jonathan's report. Like MGI, Mary has done a lot of work on the actual business activities and behavior of firms and industrial policy in China, and so has particular insights from that. I will note for all the Institute aficionados that we are delighted to welcome Mary back full-time as of today. And she, of course, continues as a distinguished professor at Syracuse University as well. We will follow that with the person who cannot be topped on China, Nicholas Lardy, the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow here at PIIE. Of course, all of you have read and bought multiple copies of his book, The State Strikes Back, as you should have. And he will be taking his broader viewpoint on Chinese domestic developments and economy in part of the discussion. And then finally, I will be speaking briefly on what I would call beware the Red Scare. I am increasingly disturbed and terrified by the framing of technological competition between the US and China in Cold War terms. And most importantly, I'm upset and terrified by this because it is pointless. And so I will try to explain why on that point. But let us start off with a very substantive opening session by Jonathan and presenting China and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam, and it's a pleasure to be back, old friends and new friends. So I'm going to start this off with two charts that are not in the report, but set the context for this. And this is the first one. This is inspired by Larry Summers. There was a meeting in Beijing about a year and a half ago where Lin Fu and a whole bunch of other folks were there celebrating China's economic opening to the outside world and 40 years of reform. And Larry came in late and essentially now read this chart, which was to say, you know, it's all very well and good, you know, congratulations. 25 years ago, we would have been saying the same thing about Japan. 40 years ago, we would have been saying the same thing about the Soviet Union. Why are you any different? Have you demonstrated the capacity for a self-sustaining, market-based, innovative mechanism that allows you to, you know, challenge the United States? And Lin Fu responded, and we went from there. But essentially, I think that was kind of, for me, a little bit of an opening wake-up call, maybe. They say, wow, China certainly got some people's attention here. This is a different conversation about China than we might have had, you know, 5 years or 10 years ago, and we'd all be, you know, stopped with the celebration. You know, the celebration would have basically been to the point, not the, oh my goodness, this is a challenge. So what's one piece of context. The second one is, of course, Graham Allison. So when these things happen, the track record has not been good. You know, most of the last couple hundred years, rising powers and dominant powers, the results have ended with violence, and maybe so. Slight sort of moment of optimism, saying it hasn't happened as frequently, more recently, possibly due to greater levels of integration in the global economy and the benefits of settling this thing with guns is no longer so apparent when you're a little bit more integrated. So is there? Are we doomed? Does the integration hypothesis save us? Or are we on the brink of repeating all the lessons of history? Which was more or less what Henry Kissinger said at the Bloomberg Forum in Singapore about a year ago or so as well. So I think that was the context for this report. I was thinking through, okay, well, maybe we should look at this issue of integration more carefully, and how integrated is it, and where might we go from here? So that's why we did the report. So, as in McKinsey fashion, we tell you up front. What we'll say is this. You know, as we looked at this over the last 6 months, 12 months, China has achieved global scale, but not global integration. It's a decidedly skewed picture. And so we can look at this as glass half full or glass half empty, and that, that there is some integration, which is great, or that there is a lot more integration to come, and which is a daunting task, perhaps, for some. The second thing we've looked at was the trend, and this was one of the more interesting and perhaps newer findings, was that we note that while the world has been becoming more integrated or more exposed, choice of words is important there, China has, over the last decade, been reducing its relative exposure to the world. So there's a certain asymmetry in the trajectory of the relationship, which may account for some of the asymmetry in the conversations we see as well. Thirdly, as we look forward, we ran a simulation, which then took from our experience, both micro and macro, of what integration does to an economy, and projected that forward to see simply what's at stake. How big a deal will this be? And the answer is, of course, a very large deal. It's probably 15 to 26%, call it around 20% of global GDP by the year 2040 will be at stake, depending on the level of integration to the Chinese and the global economy. With all of that, that's a meaningful enough uncertainty in anybody's macro forecast to mean that now it should be baked in, essentially, to strategies, and that's what we start to see. We start to see businesses responding to this new level of uncertainty with a host of adaptive mechanisms, whether it's around their supply chains or their technology management or their customer focus. And not to give it away, but we do see regionalization as an outcome of this. The McKinsey Global Institute recently put out another report on the global value chain, which speaks to that especially. So that's kind of the top line. I'm going to take it in quickly. So global scale, but more could be done to integrate with the world. We looked at 8 things. We looked at trade, of course. We also looked at firms, how integrated are Chinese firms into the global economy. We looked at capital flows, not only of FDI, but of all capital. People, migrants, students, tourists, you name it. Technology, importantly, both intellectual property and its products. Data flows, bandwidth, the environment, and culture. So we tried to make this more than simply a trade assessment to say how integrated is China, and what did we find? So trade-wise, I mean, of course, China has become the largest trader of goods. It's gone from the 2% to the 11% over the last 20 years. US has slipped back, so now it's approximately 11. But what we see in services is a decidedly different picture. So that China's services exports and imports are much lower, and that potentially, again, represents either a shortcoming or an opportunity. So who is trading with China? Basically the neighbors. So China trade really matters to people close to China. So it matters to Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. It also matters to people who sell things to China that China cannot make, such as resources. And to some extent, it really matters to countries that really need the money. So capital exposure and exports from China matter a lot in some lesser developed countries. But if we look at developed economies, again, much lower levels of exposure. If we look by industries, it's not a surprise that technology is the focus of our current set of discussions, as that is the most global part of industry. So computer, electronics, and machinery and equipment, those are the ones where you see higher shares of global exports and greater levels of trade intensity, higher share of global exports from China. Also, of course, some labor-intensive, relatively speaking, commodities that are traded, textiles and furniture. And finally, again, the resources. So those are the areas of the global economy that's traded that we would expect to see direct impacts from it on of China's integration into the global economy. The firms. As we all know, China has a lot of big companies. This perhaps is surprising. Those companies are not very global. So less than 40% of the level of revenues earned outside their home country from Chinese multinationals versus United States, US multinationals. So big companies, not very global companies. And that's, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, that's largely due to the constitution of who those big companies are, very large state companies for the most part, very domestically oriented. Capital. Largest banking system in the world, practically the least foreign ownership in the world. So China's financial system, largely autarkic. The stock market, though by no means as significant, certainly in the Chinese context, also relatively separate. And overall cross-border capital flows, relatively minor compared to the US. So foreign ownership and cross-border flows, limited, capital markets largely not integrated. People. This is an interesting one, of course. China is a great exporter of people. Largest number of students overseas are Chinese, 17%. Tourism, 9%. It's a fascinating number. Chinese tourists now account for 9% of all retail consumption in Thailand. So Chinese tourists are a force to be reckoned with. Migration, perhaps not so much. I mean, certainly as a share of global migrant population, not exactly where relative to its population, not as big, but also inbound, as you can see, nothing. So China exports a lot, does not import so much. Technology. This is something I'm sure we'll debate. China has become a major global spender on R&D. Much of that R&D expenditure is just parenthetically by multinationals in China, but it's a big number regardless. But what we see when we look at intellectual property charges is the profile of a massive intellectual property importer. So China is not a significant exporter of intellectual property itself at this stage. Some of that technology, of course, is embedded in products and services which are exported, but again, that is not the profile that we've seen of China's exports either. So we have to put the context here about where exactly China is. And we've done a bit of a more forensic investigation on the technology conversation. We can go there. But essentially it says that China has global standards, uses global standards. China largely localizes a portion of those global standards, but still is a significant technology import for almost everything we looked at. And only a minority of the Chinese technology production that we looked at can be said to have global export winning performance, and so dominating global exports in those categories. So that's a bit of a profile. There are a couple of other things that we looked at, as I mentioned, which for reasons of time I won't go into, but are in the report. Culture is one of them. My Korean colleague who co-wrote the report insisted that we put on a comparison of the performance of the top Chinese music streaming artists to the top Korea pop or K-pop artists, and much to the disadvantage of China. So there's quite a bit of an opportunity here for China to improve its performance on some of those other dimensions. In terms of bandwidth and technology, China has approximately the cross-border bandwidth of Singapore. So again, those are areas where we see there's a lot more opportunity perhaps for integration than there has been so far. So the trend was one of the more sort of counterintuitive, because on a day-to-day basis, of course, when we walk around China, we sort of feel globalization. We see Starbucks. We've been seeing KFC for a long time. And we see more people speaking English, or we see a bit more foreign tourism and so forth. But when you add it up, what becomes clear is that the momentum behind the Chinese domestic economy and the Chinese domestic supply chain outpaces the momentum behind the foreign import-export trade, or the tourists, or the capital flows. And that's a relative number, of course, relative to the momentum for that level of integration outside of China in other major economies. So this is essentially the weighted average exposure of 7 large economies to China, and of China's exposure to them. And what you will see is back in the year 2000, China was relatively less exposed, and China was. The world was less exposed to China, and China was less exposed to the world, and for neither China nor the world was this as important a relationship as the average exposure of the large economies to each other. So that relationship flipped over the last 17 years, where China now became much more important to the world. And while China's exposure to the world is still there, and it's still almost approximately where it was before, it's clearly become less relative to the total weighted average exposure of all large economies. In other words, simply, I think the best way to think about it is that as China has grown as a share of global trade, a share of global production, as a share of global marketplaces, a share of global capital, this has been growing faster than the world's total average economy. And as a result, China has become much more material to the world. On the other hand, China's domestic markets have grown much faster than its foreign trade profile, its foreign capital exposure profile, and that's a function both of consumption impacts as well as the deepening and more complexity of the domestic supply chain itself. So it's actually two factors at work here. One is the Chinese consumer driving the growth of the Chinese economy, and the Chinese supply chain becoming more complex, and as a result, reducing the level of intermediate product imports that used to require Chinese integration with the world. So there are two things going on here. That was a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to close with one other sort of piece of data, which is this simulation, and so how we thought about that. As we said, the top line is about 15 to 26% of global GDP could be at stake from less or more engagement between China and the world. That's an underestimation. I mean, there are a number of dimensions where that could be bigger. We highlight one or two. So with the mechanism for that transmission, first of all, is growth of China as an import destination. China clearly has a lower level of imports relative to GDP than a comparably sized economy at similar levels of economic development. So there could be opportunities there. And we do start to see that, of course, that as China moves up the value chain, particularly in the last couple of years, it's opened up opportunities for lower developing countries, particularly Bangladesh, Vietnam, Philippines, to India, to fill that gap. And so we do see a growth in imports, particularly in labor-intensive products there. But equally importantly, the more advanced wedge of consumption should also grow, and as imports of advanced products and technology from around the world. That, of course, translates into greater levels of consumption, greater levels of productivity growth, greater levels of investment, all of which is modeled there. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly for China at least, is the liberalization of services, being the largest portion of the economy, also the one where we see the most significant productivity gap. And what we can identify is that, of course, growth in competition does spur productivity development, and that growth in competition includes the liberalization of services to allow for foreign participation, whether we're talking about financial services or retail or logistics or healthcare or culture or you name it. So quite a long way to go there, and by anybody's measure, again, China has significant barriers to that liberalization today relative to other OECD countries, and so there is certainly potential for that growth to happen. Globalization of financial markets is a third aspect. We noted that it was largely an autarkic regime, which has led to a significant level of volatility and in the Chinese economy, and we would contend globally as well. That we will see going forward a scenario where those markets remain, or there remains a separation between the Chinese and the global financial market to be an environment characterized by high levels of instability, high levels of illiquidity, and ultimately high levels of resource misallocation of the growth in NPLs and the write-offs and the collateral damage from that. So a scenario where that is less true, where there is more levels of cross-border capital flow and greater levels of transparency, we believe would create a significant amount of value for China and for the world. Finally, collaboration on global public goods almost speaks for itself. There are some things which, if there is no collaboration, we will not have them. That includes climate. It includes health and security as well. And with that, we note that the effects of climate change, of course, could be much more significant beyond the time frame of the analysis here. So we will probably only see the beginnings of those impacts. And lastly, flows of technology and innovation, a well-established relationship between the capacity of technology to cross borders and the rate of technical productivity growth. And we do see that as being a benefit to, again, China and the world. In all of these things, there is a downside and an upside, or at least in most of them, and since greater or less relative to anybody's view of the base case going out. What we're trying to measure here is the total value at stake in a simulation of saying what would be a greater or lesser level of integration. And as also, in all these things, resources or value may not be equally shared between China and the world and anybody else. And that's not, again, included in the simulation, but it should be noted that this is, again, there could be pluses and minuses within a total pool of value. So with that, businesses will adjust. We've seen people starting to reassess their exposure. We certainly have seen that happening. Almost everybody is exposed to the China and world relationship. It is a factor for consumption, for production, for research, for distribution. So that assessment of what level of risk is entailed in that relationship for the business is certainly a meaningful consideration. With that, we see adjustments in investment and value chain postures. As I mentioned, regionalization is largely the response that we've started to see. A greater growth in intra-Asia trade and a establishment of ways to mitigate the risk of cross-border or particularly cross-regional trade. Operational excellence around that, sort of a lot more agility, a lot more investment in supply chain transparency, technologies which simply did not exist a few years ago and now enable us to go back 2, 3, 4 layers in the supply chain to know exactly what's coming from where, which will be very interesting. And finally, we note adopting a survivor's mindset. As we all know, in China, the word for crisis is both opportunity and challenge. So while there are threats, there are also opportunities here. And we do see businesses understanding that and starting to look for opportunities to acquire and restructure as this greater level of uncertainty creates greater levels of opportunity. That's the report. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank Jonathan for offering such an interesting and rich report on my first day back at Peterson. We're off to a good start. This new McKinsey Global Institute report offers a timely wake-up call about the benefits of global integration and cooperation. In an era of big power competition and failing multilateralism, it's tempting to lose sight of the economic benefits of engagement and the costs of adopting policies such as blanket tariffs and overly restrictive investment rules that further global disintegration. Today's MGI report lays down a marker of sorts that prompts us to deepen our consideration of the costs of engagement and the benefits of further integration. In a way, it asks us to sober up and get serious about what the costs are going to be. The author's report heroically offers an estimate of the potential upside of greater engagement of China with the world. They argue it's the creation of an additional 9 to 14% of global GDP by 2040, as well as the potential costs of greater division, the loss of potentially 6 to 12% of global GDP. While naturally highly speculative, these numbers indicate that the economic consequences of a new Cold War, World War I to come, would be very high for all players. The report presents overwhelming evidence that China is now a major player in the world economy, not just as an exporter of manufactured goods, which is the way we often see it presented, but as a large and growing market for other countries' exports, as a source of R&D, and as a provider of investment capital. The authors highlight the opportunities offered by deeper cooperation and coordination between China and the world. They stay clear of forecasting whether such an engagement will actually happen, choosing instead to examine in detail what's at stake and why. The report ranges widely across trading partners, economic sectors, and technologies. It's impressive in scope and rich in detail. The report is so rich, in fact, that it raises a simple and irresistible question. With so much to be gained from deeper engagement, why is the United States actively turning away from China? Although the MGI authors do not directly tackle this question, they assiduously stay away from it, in fact, material in the report suggests 3 non-national security, which we'll leave completely aside today, perspectives that shed some light on the current conflict from an economic viewpoint, and why, despite the likely benefits of restoring and enhancing this relationship, the path forward is likely to be one of more, not less, conflict. The first perspective is that incomplete Chinese liberalization in the past makes future liberalization less likely. Basically, uneven integration weakens support for deeper engagement in the future. In the United States, China is seen as a source of imports and the cause of manufacturing job losses. Surprisingly, though, Chinese imports are a small share of domestic consumption in the United States and other advanced economies. This unimportance is often overlooked because China's penetration into advanced economy markets has been highly concentrated in a few sectors. It's important in important places. China's early concentration in labor-intensive exports has now been eclipsed by its oversized presence in high-tech value chains. This present-day concentration has two drawbacks. It means the gains are perceived to be very narrowly distributed within the United States and other advanced economies, and it makes China's relationship with the West highly vulnerable to specific concerns such as national security concerns focused on information technology and its applications. As a market for advanced country exports, China also has too many eggs in too few baskets. While being the largest purchaser of U.S. soybeans is handy in a trade war, the concentration of Chinese imports in a few sectors means weaker general support in the West for more openness. As the report points out, China restricts the access of foreign service providers to its domestic market, depressing its own service sector productivity. But the cost of such restrictions goes way beyond China's domestic economy and its efficiency. Service sector barriers contribute to slow import growth in China. They limit the ability of advanced economies to make use of their comparative advantage in services. Despite obvious gains from lower prices on components and intermediate goods, support among U.S. producers for further integration with China has been dampened by China's own weak service import growth. As the MGI authors emphasize, this lopsided situation offers valuable opportunities for both China by opening its service sector and to its trading partners by allowing for export expansion. But as we're seeing now, the current unevenness of Chinese exports and imports makes it easier to find losers and harder to find winners, and thus narrows the path to future integration. Secondly, the report reaffirms the view that technology supply chains are highly integrated between the world and China, and informs us of how much China can move up the value chain if it has continued access to core foreign technologies. The question that gets raised is, okay, but what's in it for the West? MGI's report documents to the extent to which China remains highly integrated into, or from a different perspective, dependent on global technology. The authors look at 81 technologies and find that in more than 90% of the cases, China follows global technology standards for mainstream applications. They also document the continued reliance of Chinese producers on foreign-made key inputs. These findings match nicely with work we did here at PIIE last year, which found that 33% of China's high-tech exports in 2016 originated in foreign-funded enterprises. China's high-tech export success is to a large extent a success of an integrated global economy focused on multinational enterprises. Partly because of the supply chain integration, China's domestic capabilities are developing quickly, with domestic products replacing imported components in many tech sectors. Despite this progress, however, MGI argues that sustained access to foreign technology is vital for China's continued movement up the value chain. Their deep dives into China's achievements in electronic vehicles, robotics, and integrated circuits show the country's continued reliance on global suppliers for key components, as well as the risks of relying on indigenous innovation alone. The authors also stress the importance of market competition and free entry for China's continued tech development. Interestingly, MGI's simulations suggest a total payoff from deeper tech engagement in the $4 to $6 trillion range by 2040, with equally large losses from disengagement. It's gratifying to see an actual number attached to what many of us have long believed, that gains from continued tech integration with China are large. With so much at stake, these estimates suggest a strong economic incentive for finding ways to split the tech goose rather than kill it. With a payoff this large, why is the West becoming an increasingly unwilling partner in China's development? Although not discussed in the report, we know that current institutions are too weak to convince many of those in the West that its share of the future surplus generated by deeper tech collaboration will be large enough to justify the potential risks. As Jonathan mentioned, the total is large, but there'll be positives and negatives across different players in the global economy. It's not only weak IP protection, but also a reasonable fear based on past experience of closed Chinese markets and subsidized Chinese competitors. The MGI report provides no answers to these difficult issues. It only reminds us that solving them is likely to have a high payoff. Finally, the report reminds us that the United States risks decoupling from China all by itself. MGI finds that along many dimensions, China's exposure to the world is falling while the world's exposure to China is rising. Exports have become relatively less important to China as it necessarily rebalances its economy toward domestic consumption. This rebalancing, however, does not mean that China has turned inward. Of the 73 economies studied by the NGI team, 69 increased their exposure to Chinese imports as a share of their domestic production. 72% increased their exposure to Chinese exports to satisfy their own domestic consumption, and 58% increased their exposure to Chinese capital as a share of domestic investment. That's all since 2007. While some countries may find current tensions between China and the US useful in pursuing their own interests, if you've been reading the paper in the last few days, you know what I'm talking about. The levels of exposure documented by the MGI team suggest that the US may find few true enthusiasts for rolling back current levels of integration. In particular, since 2007, China has become a more important partner to countries with close regional proximity and those with significant natural resources. These countries are unlikely to willingly decouple. In sum, today's MGI report insightfully illustrates the potential gains from deeper engagement of China in the world economy. The tone of the report is relentlessly upbeat, and it's a powerful counterpoint to current narratives of death by China. But the research also provides reasons for diminished support for such engagement and for profound concern about how the gains from integration will be shared. Thank you, and thanks to Jonathan for the report.
Well, good morning. I'm going to switch gears and talk primarily about the domestic economy rather than linkages between China and the rest of the world, a topic I'm sure we'll go back to when we take the stage. Essentially, the key question I think people are asking these days is, why is China slowing down? And it is slowing down. It grew at 6.4% in the first quarter of this year. But in the first quarter of last year, it grew at 6.8%. In the whole year, it grew at 6.6%. So we're clearly seeing a slowdown. And I think the slowdown is more marked than those numbers suggest, because domestic demand has slowed dramatically this year because there was an almost unprecedented, part of the growth of the 6.4%, a very large share of it was caused by about a 2/3 increase in China's net exports, which contributed more than a percentage point to China's economic growth. So domestic demand is only growing at about 5.5%. In 2018, domestic demand was growing at over 7%. So there's been a big step down in the growth of domestic demand. I think this very large increase in China's net exports is clearly unsustainable. It's already beginning to shrink, and it's likely to shrink further. So unless we see some pickup in domestic demand over the balance of the year, it's conceivable that growth in some quarters could slip to below 5%. So what's the slowdown? What's the cause of the slowdown? Is it the trade war, or is it something else? I think it's mostly something else, and I think that something is the squeezing out of the private sector. Oh, I'm going to go the other way. This diagram you've seen before if you've looked at my book that was released earlier this year. I mean, the most dramatic evidence in the squeezing out of the private sector is the marked decline in the share of bank lending going to private companies, particularly after 2013. Now, I've been waiting to update this slide, but unfortunately, the most recent issue of the Financial Almanac published by the People's Bank, which just came out a few weeks ago, has discontinued the table that provides this data. So I can't tell you what's happened, but I think things have gotten worse for the private sector because as they lost access to bank credit, they turned increasingly to non-bank financial institutions, but the Chinese perhaps wisely decided that non-bank lending had a lot of extra risk, and so they've been squeezing back on that. So first private firms lost access to bank credit. They partially substituted by going to non-banks. Now that source of funding is drying up, further weakening the private sector. And we've seen some pretty dramatic evidence of what that has led to in 2017, and I think also continue in 2018, as private firms were required to pay off loans prior to their maturity. They didn't have the cash. They had the shares that they had pledged for the listed companies to the banking and other financial institutions were purchased by companies that had access to cash, which were mostly state companies. So in effect, what happened in 2017 and 2018 is there was a substantial nationalization of private companies as a result of the credit squeeze. Now, what's happened more recently, the authorities have recognized the problems of the private sector. Financial regulators have put out a whole slew of directives, admonitions to banks that they should lend more to private companies. Xi Jinping had this very highly publicized meeting with private entrepreneurs in which he patted them on the back and told them how important they were and how policy was going to change, that they would get better access to credit. I think the evidence suggests that those promises have not been fulfilled. This is the first quarter. Overall bank lending is up by about 14%. And the loan balance to what the Chinese call people-run firms, which is mostly private firms, but also includes a small number of collective firms, was going up at roughly half the rate. So obviously the share of bank lending in the first quarter of this year did not go up. It has continued to decline. And I don't think this will change until there is a major change in Chinese financial policy, and that is getting rid of the implicit guarantee for loans by the state to loans to state companies. Private companies, on average, are far more creditworthy. Their return on assets is much higher. Their interest rate coverage is much higher than state companies on average. But if there's zero risk in lending to a state company, that's where all the money is going to go. So I would say unless they change that fundamental characteristic of the financial system, that private firms are likely to continue to have difficulty. Now, what have been the consequences of this? Well, first of all, private sector growth in the industrial sector has declined dramatically relative to state companies. If you look at this period from 2005 to 2015, on average, private companies were growing. It was some variation year to year and so forth, but on average over that decade, private companies were growing twice as fast. Then as they lost access to credit, private firms continued to slow down, state companies began to pick up, and you can see in 2017 and 18, on average, state companies grew slightly faster than private companies. So and this is not because there's not some big structural change. Private companies account for about 75% of industrial output. So this is not the result of some change in the product mix demand that has had an adverse effect on private companies. I think it's a far more general phenomenon. So this is the first result of the squeezing out of the private sector. And the second is that the number of private LLCs has declined dramatically in the last couple of years. Now, I'm focusing on private LLCs because these are the bigger private companies. There are about 14 million private companies. The vast majority of them are small little private proprietorships or partnerships or small companies. You can see at the peak, we grew from about 500,000, a little bit less than 500,000 private LLCs in 2010 to about 2 million by 2015. So these are the much bigger private companies. Then as the squeezing out of finance began to take hold, you can see in 2016 that the net formation of private LLCs was leveled off, indeed was slightly negative. And then in 2017, we had a 10% decline in the number of private LLCs. Now, there's no accounting for this, there's no explanation, but I think it was mostly a lack of finance. I think a lot of big private companies exited, they went through bankruptcy, or they in effect were nationalized. So China has lost the most important source of its economic growth as a result of the policies that have favored state companies. And I think that problem is likely to persist until we see a fundamental change in policy, getting rid of the tilt in favor of state companies. Thank you.
What I'd like to do is shift back to the international side from Nick's excellent and Mary's excellent discussion of developments inside China. What I would like to do, in fact, is try to rebut some of the national security arguments that are currently being bandied about by a wide range of influential people in Washington for changing the economic relationship between the US and China. I start from a simple fact. China exists, and a second simple fact. Regime change is a loser as a policy. And these two simple facts have to be brought into perspective in every discussion of American foreign policy at this date. The fictions that remain that the US can affect massive change domestically in China, and it is absurd on two counts. First, even in tiny countries that we militarily occupy, we have been unsuccessful repeatedly in getting stable regime change. China is not a tiny country we will occupy. Second, like any other large country, including the US, fundamentally its destiny is in its own hands. As the McKinsey people have pointed out, as China has developed, it has become less economically dependent, still massively so, still able to make huge gains from global integration, but China is less economically dependent now on the rest of the world than it was. So the very premise of the discussion that we have today in the US, all about essentially regime change in China, and that is indeed, if you read barely between the lines of not just John Bolton and Vice President Pence and Peter Navarro, but various statements made by Democratic Party elected officials, that we cannot have a constructive, peaceful partnership with China so long as they are nasty and behave and play the game in different ways than we want it to be played. This, to me, is just going to repeat many of the mistakes the US has done to itself for the last 70 to 80 years in the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period. And in particular, this fundamentally misunderstands the nature of technological development and competition in the modern world. Why am I talking about this? Because for those of you who are not here in the room, who may be watching, I hope, elsewhere, Washington has gone crazy with a red tech scare. Both parties are piling on. If anything, if President Trump makes some sort of deal with China, even if later only to renege on it, he will be attacked by Democratic candidates as being soft on China. And we are getting to the point very soon where, like the 50s in the US or the 70s, anyone who says this policy is folly gets attacked for being unpatriotic or being foolish. This, as we saw in the 50s and the 70s and early 80s, was a terrible mistake to the US's own detriment, and we should not repeat it. Most of all, this argument does not depend on any fantasies on my part about positive, constructive motivations by the Chinese Communist Party. This is not about China's motivations. There have been serious articles written recently. There was a group letter that some of my colleagues recently signed that appeared in the Washington Post. There's a recent article by Susan Aronson. There are articles in Foreign Affairs, all of them trying to discern the motivations for China. How aggressive would the Communist Party leadership wish to be? How confrontational does it wish to be? For purposes of technological competition, it doesn't even matter. The question is whether China's technological development in and of itself presents a threat to the US, and whether the US has any means to deal with that are not going to be more harmful than letting it go. And so the only thing that can stop China's rise in economic and technological terms are the failings of China itself. And as Nick Lardy pointed out, and argued at more length in his book, The State Strikes Back, China's leadership is doing that to itself right now. And so, before I get more specific, let me make one more broad point. There is this much written about, and in Washington, again, not in the nation, but in Washington, very palpable sense, oh, we all had these crazy fantasies that China would change as a result of PNTR or WTO accession or further discussion. And we're all beating our chests saying, what a mistake we made. Intellectually, it was a mistake. Many of us at the time thought this was all exaggerated marketing, just as the US made ridiculous marketing for NAFTA 25 years ago. But it was not something that forces us now to say, time to give up. If you remember the text of the American Cold War, God, I can't think of his name, George Kennan's long telegram, which becomes the X article in Foreign Affairs, he talks about a long twilight fight. It was decades of standing up to the Soviet Union for the change to happen. And in fact, still, as Kennan later argued, happened faster than he expected, despite taking decades. The idea that 20 years, it's time to give up and assume that China we have a limited window before they overtake us and that we are in imminent danger is a fundamental misreading of the world and of history. And so in particular, like many contemporary political scientists and historians, I view the Thucydides trap as junk history. Several people much more scholarly than I have written about this. It ignores, in the basic social science sense, it's got a selection bias because it doesn't mention all the rivals that came and went without war. And it's got an omitted variable bias because it doesn't even attempt to talk about the differences between regimes. And it critically misses the point that Germany and Japan in particular in the 20th century converted to imperialism in part because of domestic ideology and in part because they both thought they were going to be cut off from vital food and energy supplies. Neither of which is necessarily the case for China. Could be, but not in the same sense it was in the 20s and 30s. So let me get back into technology and economics more directly. We have this notion now that is challenging Cordell Hull and Franklin Roosevelt that we should be combining national security and economics. This is now becoming a commonplace. Trump administration officials from Vice President Pence to National Security Advisor Bolton to whatever his job title is, Peter Navarro, remind us that there is this thing called economic security that must be pursued. And again, I'm not going to list them, but there are China hawks, as it were, on other parties as well. This is not a concept that works very well. If we think about the technological aspect of what goes on, let us remember that what are the main threats that have harmed the US of late? Cyber attacks, cyber infiltration, threats to our grid and our infrastructure, the rise now being written about in the public press of the supersonic missile development, and what the Homeland Security community always emphasizes, the acts of domestic, mostly, white terrorists doing dirty bombs and local attacks. None of these require deep technology, with the exception of the supersonic missile development. None of these are threats because China now has more technological capability than it did. All of these are coming from places either hating people's backyards or from Russia and North Korea, neither of which present in any way a technological challenge to the US, neither of which have any great technological claims. So the very threats that our national security establishment and homeland security establishment list as the primary threats to the US have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with China's technological development. And yet we are in this frenzy that occurs today. We also have an issue that even if China develops technologically, what does it mean? As often is the case, people focus on where economists disagree, specific estimates of how many manufacturing jobs were displaced during the rise of China's manufacturing, and don't focus on where they do agree. One of the greatest truths of economic development and technology is the idea that what matters is not developing the technology, what matters is adapting and diffusing and implementing and using the technology. This is why international development is difficult. Anybody can reverse engineer or nowadays buy something on the internet. Saudi or Brunei should be a technological master if it's just a question of getting the technology. They should be hugely successful. They are not. The message, which usually goes under the misleading term institutions, but that's what the language of the economists is that it's the institutions that matter. And we see this at the advanced level as well. What was the difference in the productivity gains between the US in the 90s and early 2000s and Western Europe and Japan? It was not that Western Europe and Japan couldn't access all the technologies that the US had, and it was only a tiny thing that the US produced various IT technologies. It was that the US much better adopted, diffused, adapted, and utilized the information technology throughout its sectors in a way that Japan and Western Europe did not. This is what McKinsey research, among others, has shown. And so the idea that the real threat from China is that they're going to somehow take over some advanced technology fundamentally misses what technology is about in economic development. And this idea holds true as well in military development. Except in outright total war, per capita income is a much better predictor of military capability than GDP. This is why Norway and Singapore and Israel have repeatedly been able to stand up and seen as major military factors when surrounded by much larger hostile powers. And there is another obvious country I will not name in the same context. It is not, unless you are in the Eastern Theater of World War II in 1944, it is not about just who gets there with the first, with the mostest. And so this idea, again, going back to charts that we've seen, that China, which has a per capita income, which even putting in for Beijing and Shanghai is a fraction of that of the US, will be able to sustain a warfighting capability is somewhat dubious. To the degree they can, it will be through these cheap, destructive measures of having 10,000 cyber hackers or having a spy network or having dirty bombs that are accessible to North Korea or to Russia or some other hostile power. The national security threat is not about China's technological development. Now, you can make an argument that there are certain specific, very narrowly put technologies that matter. We have with us Claudia Bunicati, our visiting fellow who works on some of these issues. We have Martin Chorzempa, who works on some of these issues in the IT space for us. And you can come up with very specific limitations. My colleague Martin referred, when we were in Beijing last together, to the idea of you have a very high fence around a very small backyard. Or rather, this was the most successful part of the export control regime in the Cold War, that you pick a couple extremely sensitive military technologies, you define them, you update this definition, you have buy-in from your allies, and you protect that limited set, but you do not assume that you need to stem all technological growth and development. Moreover, even if you try, it usually doesn't work. Let us not forget that the atomic bomb, the greatest military secret, the greatest technological leap forward in human history in the military sphere, was the number one secret. And yet, a low-tech Soviet spy was able to take the plans. And even then, it was only because they had Sakharov, they had others in the Soviet Union, that they could finally make something of the plans. You cannot protect the blueprints. But further, let me go into the economic sphere. The thinking of intellectual property theft and economic value in terms of blueprints is last century at best's idea. Most of the value added that we see in the modern economy is in brands, is in services, is in business practices, is in expertise. It is not in a specific patented small design. People buy the Apple iPhone in some ways because it's better, but not really because there's some processor that is secret to Apple that makes it do amazing tricks. It's that people like Apple. Why is Coca-Cola huge in China and Pepsi is not? Why is KFC huge in China and Pepsi is not? And McDonald's is not? Pure marketing. Delivery of what was seen as quality food, relationships with the political class, moving in. Billions of dollars are at stake solely on the basis of marketing, not on the basis of KFC having a superior chicken frying technology. And we have seen this for decades. So KFC used to talk about the 7 ingredients and spices that the Colonel used, and Coke used to talk about its secret formula, and that was marketing. As the Pepsi challenge showed, no one can tell the difference between Coke and Pepsi, and if they think they can, they usually pick Pepsi. It's not about the technology. It's about the distributional value added, the marketing, the economy. There is not some huge share of the US economy that is subject to theft. Finally, we have to remember that the so-called theft of intellectual property that Chinese companies engage in, and I'm not denying that they do, is actually par for the course. The way the US got ahead in the late 18th, early 19th century was visibly violating the Navigation Acts of Britain, which were meant to prevent interchangeable parts and loom technology from moving outside the UK, and which came with actively attracting skilled migrants from the UK to transfer these skills and values. Part of the way the UK got ahead was stealing tea from China to plant in India. And tea was the GMO special breed crop of its day. And the British figured out, maybe we can put it in India and grow it and we won't have to pay silver to the Chinese. Now again, hypocrisy's fine, and I'd rather be ruled right now by the US than by even this regime than by the Chinese Communist Party. So the fact that there were these past instances doesn't mean we should give up. But what is more important is it reminds you that the idea of sitting on small technologies or even big technologies is not something that works. And it reminds you that countries survive even when these technologies move. And so we have a world where US leadership is going crazy, as they did in the 50s, as they did in the late 70s and early 80s, and we should try to stop it. If China goes down a foolish road itself, which it seems to be doing, then the only thing to save them is if the US messes itself up. So Belt and Road, as we warned in a publication from the Institute 5 years ago, is just going to repeat the imperial mistakes of the Americans and the British. And we're already seeing that with the backlash in South Asia and in Africa to their initiatives. Crony capitalism comes out automatically from picking national champions. This is Nick's argument bravely and rightly, and this is what we're seeing. And we see it in the US. We're going to end up with people telling us that Boeing is a national security interest and we have to force people to buy Boeing, when Boeing is a classic example of too big to fail outside the financial sector, and it leads to people's death because Boeing is not being held accountable and has captured the national security state and captured the regulatory apparatus. So enough of this nonsense of national champions and economic technological competition. Let us call it out. Again, there are very specific technologies we can debate about 5G, about supersonic missiles, about certain kinds of eavesdropping. But that is a very limited thing to be done and does not merit the atmosphere and the general policy approach that our government is pursuing. So finally, let me conclude with what I don't want and what I do want. One response to all of this, and we've heard it a couple times from distinguished speakers on this platform, is it's okay. We know this is garbage, but it's our Sputnik moment. Let's capture this. Let's take advantage of the fervor over China and say, invest a lot in R&D, learn new languages, get people in the military. It'll be worth it. I fundamentally believe that preying on people's fears and lying to them is a bad way to make policy. I fundamentally believe that part of the reason we have the problems politically we have now is because elites kept trying to sell stuff by playing on people's fears rather than being honest. And I think it would be a terrible mistake to do this again. The alternative is I think we need to think in terms of economic détente with China and what I'll call directed deterrence. That you have deterrence in specific areas like cyber crime and damage, which is where the Obama administration and more importantly, the national security establishment were going until the red tech scare took hold. Beware the red tech scare. Thank you. I would like to call up my colleagues who spoke earlier to the platform, Jonathan, Mary, Nick, and we'll take questions. In particular, many of you I know have been waiting to ask Jonathan about the McKinsey report and his presentation, and we would prioritize questions about that up first. As usual, there is standing mic at the back. Jessica has a roving mic up front. Please raise your hand and be recognized if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, and please identify yourself when you do. Anyone? Yes, please. Sorry, can you wait for the microphone, please?
Okay, I'll
I'm sorry, your name, please?
Steve Charnovitz at George Washington University. So for Jonathan, if you could, since it was noted by you and by Mary that China services market is not as open as it could be, not as liberalized as it could be, I'm wondering, is there any improvement of that in any of the free trade arrangements that you talked about? Maybe those countries would not be that competitive on exports to China of services, but I'm just wondering, is there any positive development in that respect? And then for Nick, you've pointed out that the reason for China's economic slowdown is largely the lack of domestic lending to the private sector. But I'm wondering if, to what extent is there also the additional explanation? How significant is that additional explanation vis-a-vis your explanation you gave? The additional explanation of the trade war. You sort of dismissed the trade war, but I'm wondering, is it just irrelevant or it maybe accounts for 10 or 20%? And then for Adam and the very interesting and thoughtful Posen thesis, because most of it I agree with, but I wasn't quite sure what you meant by regime change. You started out talking about regime change, and generally, when one thinks about regime change, you think about switching out the leadership of another country. And I would agree, I think, with what you said, that that's unlikely to happen, just as it's unlikely that China is going to be able to switch out our leadership. But if what you meant by regime change, and I thought that's what you meant, was more of changing China's economic policy or political policy or cultural policy, and then you said, well, it's just very hard to accomplish. Certainly the United States can't do it unilaterally. And I would agree with it's difficult for the United States to do that unilaterally. But you didn't say anything really about the role of regimes, like the trade regime, the climate regime, the human rights regime, the role of international multilateral regimes in potentially influencing China. It seems to me there has been influence by the trading system, by the climate system. And if the United States were to double down on its investment in those regimes rather than walk away from them, the multilateral regimes, it seems to me to be a much more positive prospect over the long run of changing China internally. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you. I apologize for being on my phone a moment. I was tweeting, telling everyone about this. That's part of my job. Jonathan, please go first.
I think so. The question was related to FTAs and services and whether we see a forward momentum in liberalizing services based on recent FTAs. And I think that, to my understanding of many of those, there has been some progress, but it's very focused by the very nature of FTAs are bilateral. So extending this for beyond to an entire sector is going to be well, it has to be an unusual bilateral relationship to do that. So most of those services, the services content, as I understand, is mostly related to either specific financial transactions and the liberalization of well, for example, currency liberalization in RMB, use as a counter trade mechanism for developing countries, or tourism as another aspect of services, and which you might see more mutual two-way investments. But to my knowledge, no, I think that this is something that's being will have to be done more on a of at least a regional, if not global, basis by Chinese policymakers. Perhaps, Mayor, you have other.
No, I agree with that. China's very involved with pushing forward RCEP, and I don't think that agreement is going to solve this issue because it's really one between China and Western economies or advanced economies. There has been recent openings in certain areas like logistics and some types of financial services. But, the question still remains, is it too little, too late? Nick, you're rubbing your hands. Are you anxious to say something here?
Just in response to in response to the question, I didn't want to imply that the trade frictions had zero effect, but I think the declining domestic demand because of the weakness of the private sector is much more important. Certainly, an expansion of tariffs by President Trump to the next $300 billion would reduce China's economic growth in 2020. But I think what we've seen so far, most estimates I've seen are talking about a couple of tenths of a percentage point at most. And what we've seen in terms of the decline in domestic demand is almost 2 full percentage points in Q1 this year compared to the average of 2018.
I just want to add one more quick point. I did want to say that from a regulatory perspective, the liberalizations on the financial services side, as Mary was mentioning, they would regard as being quite significant relative to previous momentum. So the ability to acquire from domestic securities exchanges, securities firms, for example. So that is happening, and that's where the momentum in the dialogue is.
Steve, thank you for your very thoughtful comments to all of us. Just to pick up, I should have made it clear. I totally support the idea that any push against China will be all the more effective, legitimate, and less costly if it is done in concert with the EU, Japan, and other allies and other supporters of the system. And it certainly has, from an economic point of view, enormous benefits when we push on China in those ways. One thing I meant to mention in Jonathan and his colleagues' MGI report is in their last slide, where they talk about where some of the biggest gains to be had if we continue to engage with China and China continues to engage with us are in the technology and development space. And I view those as fundamental. But I did get a little bit broad in my concept of regime change, but I guess the lesson I unfortunately take from the last 10 to 15 years is nobody ever changes in a fundamental way. So when I look at the Euro area and the distinctions between Greece and Germany, when I look in the US and the distinctions between Alabama and New York, when I look at Japan and Korea, who go through crisis and have various changes and still retain their fundamental nature, when I look at Mexico, that has had the benefits of NAFTA, which are undoubted in the economic sphere, but whose regime seems very similar to what it was 20 years. I have come to the sad conclusion that you only get change either when there's a cataclysm, which we have no business advocating for, which I know you don't, or when a people wake up themselves. Think of Meiji Japan, think of post-war Germany. And so sadly, I think the best we can do in any of these situations is just try to do the right thing and stick to our own knitting and not have dreams that we're going to really affect the internal behavior or external behavior that much of any other country.
Bob Samuelson, Washington Post. This is for Jonathan and Mary. I obviously have not read your report, but it seems to be full of useful numbers, which you've crunched in many ways, and so I thank you for that. But it does not seem that you asked the question, are these changes driven simply by a kind of random effect of economic growth, or is there some strategic plan or vision that the Chinese have developed, and is that vision compatible with our national self-interest?
By changes, I think you refer to the trend in terms of the greater China becoming more Chinese, and then by implication, the world becoming more exposed to China on the asymmetry, right? So, yeah. Then, well, no, yeah, I would say yes and no. I mean, that in terms of whether there was an overall vision for this. Clearly, there was an overall aspiration for China to become a middle developed country by the year 2050 or something, I think was Deng Xiaoping's expressed hope, 34 years ago. China's slightly ahead of schedule against that. But, that is less a plan and a hope for aspiration and a set of principles, which were then embodied in economic reform and the opening to the outside, economic opening to the outside world. How that's been implemented has been very much trial and error and pay-as-you-go kind of a philosophy. So, I mean, it's hard to sort of say that there is actually a plan in many ways about the Chinese reform principles, reform process. But that said, I mean, I think broadly defined that from an economic perspective, at least, there's been tremendous benefits, net benefits to the United States of China's economic reform and opening to the outside world. As one note in the report, multinationals have a 40% market share of the categories in which they compete in China, compared to multinationals' share of 20% in the United States. So disproportionately successful in China compared to in the United States for multinationals. And if one takes that view that economic growth and prosperity of corporations is a fundamental driver of U.S. prosperity, then you'd argue that this is consonant with the prosperity of the American people. But, I think there are a lot of intervening variables, of course. So that on balance, China has been a very big contributor to global prosperity and integration and economic opening, and the principles that were enunciated, I think, are a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the report does talk a little bit about economic strategy. It certainly discusses China's tech strategy in a number of areas. It has the advantage of, really keeping it real by providing a deep dive into certain technologies and certain areas that allow us to, sort of hold accountable broad statements about Chinese strategy and their outcomes. So I think it's very useful in terms of building blocks that you could use to think about any particular viewpoint that you might want to dive into further. I think that it also, as I mentioned in my comments, really illustrates the unevenness of integration. It highlights those areas where integration has been deep and the evolution of that integration with, as Jonathan mentioned, increasing integration of the world with China over time. But, you know, the incredible penetration of multinational corporations into China's consumer market, the absolutely essential role of China's linking into global value chains in the tech sphere to its export success after its joining the WTO. These were phenomenal and yet, limited in the sense that they weren't perhaps as widely shared as one might want. And one can link that back to U.S. economic strategy if one wants. So I think the benefit of the report is not to just maybe discuss at a large or 30,000-foot level these strategies and their potential clashes, but to give a lot of real nitty-gritty deep dive into different sectors, countries, technologies that you can use to look at these strategies for yourself.
Thank you. One more question at the back, please. Yes.
Thank you. A reporter from Voice America. I wondering whether I can ask some question about the renewed talks between China and the United States. So will there be any deal after this round of talk? And if so, what is it will be like? The second question is, what is behind the renewed talks and the trade war truce? Has something to do with the president election in 2020? And the third one, in China. Okay, thank you.
Mary, since you're the one trade person on the panel, maybe you want to take that?
Well, if I do know what the outcome of the talks, I'm not telling you because that could make me a lot of money. So we don't know what the outcome of the talks will be. We do know that there is at least desire from both sides to continue talking, weigh the continuing political advantages of reaching an agreement versus not reaching an agreement. And we hope, of course, keeping in mind the very important economic consequences of not reaching an agreement, which were highlighted by today's report. So I think we're going to have to wait and see and continue the conversation. And as I said, it raises the level of our own game in terms of talking about the costs of disintegration and the benefits of deeper integration for both sides to make the right choices as we move forward.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you for coming out on a post-July 4th morning to a substantive event at the Peterson Institute, when you all could have been drying out your basements instead. I want to thank Nick Lardy for updating his views on the China outlook, which on its own terms is a fascinating thing to have, and of course was a huge contribution to today's discussion. I want to thank Mary Lovely for building on her research, engaging with the real world of the McKinsey Global Institute research. And especially I want to thank and congratulate Jonathan Woetzel and his colleagues at McKinsey Global Institute for letting us premiere their report, China and the World. Thank you very much.